Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm bringing you guys a brand new catch-up review video where I get to review and talk about several albums and EPs released earlier this year that for whatever reason I didn't have a chance to talk about in full when they initially dropped. So yeah, you guys know the drill by this point. I'm just going to start off with talking about the first project I want to review today, this new album from Bad Religion, Age of Unreason. When it comes to a band this far in their career like Bad Religion, you typically expect them to just be, dropping albums for the sake of dropping them. Not really doing much with their career, just putting out safe projects, if you will. Their best days are behind them and all of that stuff. So when I came into this new project here, I wasn't really expecting a whole ton from this album. And overall, my expectations were met with this thing. I think at the end of the day, this is a pretty average project from Bad Religion. I don't think it's bad, but at the same time, I don't really think it's necessarily very good either. It certainly has its moments, but at the same time, there are some weaknesses to this thing that just make it a kind of forgettable experience overall. My biggest complaint with this project is something I alluded to earlier, that being that the band on this project kind of seems like they're on autopilot, and like they really don't care all that much about the energy or the quality of the material that's put onto this thing, because for the most part, all the cuts on this thing just feel pretty typical for the band. They're not really performed with a bunch of energy either. It just kind of feels like everything was phoned in to some extent. The vocals on this thing also sound a bit rough at times too, and not like in a good way either. Just kind of like they were done in like one or two takes and just kind of sloppily put together with the rest of this project. I will say that the rest of the instrumentation on this album is pretty okay for the most part. Not particularly terrible, but at the same time not particularly great either. I mean, it works decent enough as background music, I guess, but that's like the best I could really say about it for the most part. A lot of the hooks across this project are probably some of the strongest moments on this album overall. For the most part, they are pretty catchy and somewhat memorable in the greater context of this project. However, I do think that if you were to pit them up against some of the other hooks that the band has produced in the past, or just a lot of other hooks out there in music in general, they're not really the most memorable overall or anything quite like that. And once again, I do think the vocals to some extent, with just how kind of weak they sound at times on this thing, don't really help sell a lot of these choruses that are supposed to be a bit more powerful and anthemic. It just doesn't really make for a nice match. Lyrically, this album is pretty political, which is something that you would expect from Bad Religion overall. And while I agree with a lot of what the band is talking about here on this project, once again, this is just another example of an album out there talking about modern issues that really doesn't add all too much to the conversation with them. It just kind of seems like it has a checklist of topics it wants to talk about, or just a bunch of different buzzwords it wants to cram into the album's runtime in order to grab people's attention. But really, when you dive into a lot of these tracks, I don't really think the band is saying anything all that new or special or interesting about these subject matters. Not really providing an interesting story to go along with it for the most part either. So at the end of the day, I just kind of end up feeling like a lot of the lyrics on this thing, while I like the overall message of them, I just feel like there's a lot of other music out there that covers these same topics, but in a way that's more interesting, refreshing, personal, really just anything that's more interesting than what you're getting here on this thing. Overall, I don't think this is a terrible project by any means. Like I said, I think the instrumentation for the most part is pretty decent, and a lot of the hooks across this project are pretty catchy as well. However, it just feels like throughout this thing that the band could really care less about what they're doing here on this project. A lot of the lyrics just kind of feel like they're throwing together a bunch of different buzzwords and popular social and political ideas, and a lot of the performances on this thing just feel like they're lacking in a lot of the energy that I would really love to see from this band on a project like this. So overall, yeah, I thought this was a pretty average album. For fans of the band, for fans of this style of music, I mean, it's not a terrible project to, at least give a listen to a couple of tracks to see if you like it or not. But if you're not a fan of this band or this style of music, this isn't an album I could really recommend to you. Moving on, the next project I want to talk about is this new album from St. Vitus, new self-titled record. Not their first self-titled record, though. I really hate it when bands have multiple self-titled records, but that's besides the point, not really important to the music itself. What do we get here on this project? Overall, once again, kind of like Bad Religion I was just talking about, this is another band that's been at it for a while now, and once again, kind of like that last Bad Religion album, I kind of feel like this is another album that just kind of sees this band on autopilot to some extent. A bit less than that last Bad Religion album I was talking about. St. Vitus do take a couple of risks here on this project, but unfortunately I don't feel like most of them end up paying off for the band at the end of the day, and a lot of them just seem like misfires. A good portion of this album sees St. Vitus doing their typical traditional doom metal sound, in particular tracks like the opening song Remains, or cuts like 12 Years in the Tomb, or Wormhole, for example. These are all songs that sees the band doing their traditional sound adequately, I guess you could say. I mean, none of these tracks are particularly great, but at the same time, they're not bad either. They're at the very least pleasant on the ears to some extent. You do have some nice riffs put into some of these tracks as well, and some decent vocal performances too. However, for the most part, listening to these tracks, I just can't help feel, but, there's a lot of other songs that this band has put out in the past that are like these tracks, but just more invigorating and interesting. And once you open the conversation to, doom metal as a whole, even just metal music as a whole, there's a lot of other songs out there like these that just do what these songs are trying to do, but better. Like I said before, this album does attempt to do a bit of experimentation at times, but like I said, for the most part, it doesn't really stick the landing all that nicely. One of the earliest examples of this is the track of Prelude 2, the second song on this thing, which is this slower acoustic cut, which I guess is supposed to be like this build-up track to the next song, Bloodshed, which I guess is supposed to be this louder, more aggressive track, which is supposed to be, kind of the opposite of the track that precedes it. Overall, Prelude 2 is just not a very interesting song in my opinion. It's definitely different from a lot of the stuff on this album, but it's just not super exciting in any way. And even as like a track that's supposed to, prelude the next song and kind of supposed to be the quiet to the next track's loud, it doesn't really work all that nicely because I feel like the next track on the album isn't particularly loud or aggressive, or, at least compared to a lot of the other songs on this thing. It just kind of feels like another song on the album. So yeah, I just kind of feel like this couple of tracks were, a bit of a misfire. The track City Park sees the band experimenting with some more atmospheric and ambient-like sounds. It's kind of an interesting experiment on paper, but the actual track you end up getting is pretty boring for the most part. There's really no simpler way to put it. It's just not a very interesting song, and I mean, it just feels like they need another 4 minutes to add to the album's runtime, so they just kind of threw this together. That's what it sounds like to me. And then the closing track to this project is another one of the more interesting things on this, the track Useless, which I do think is one of the stronger cuts on this album taken on its own. However, the odd thing about this track is, despite the fact that everything else prior on the album sees St. Vitus doing their traditional doom sound, or at least other sounds that are still slower and doomy sounding, this last track sees the band trying to make like a hardcore punk song. And the first time I listened through the album, I thought that maybe this was like some bonus track that just wasn't listed as a bonus track, and maybe they were covering some hardcore punk song from the 80s I just hadn't heard of before. But every time I've looked on the internet to see if this is the case, that's not what I have found. Every time I look, this is the actual closing track to the album. And maybe I'm wrong with that, and everywhere I've looked on the internet is just wrong also. If you happen to have any information as to whether or not this is the case, please feel free to leave it in the comment section down below. I greatly appreciate knowing. But as far as I'm concerned, and with what I know now, this is the closing track to the album. And as a closing track, it doesn't really work all that nicely. Mostly because, as I just said, it's a hardcore punk song that's closing out an album of, for the most part, traditional doom metal. It just doesn't really make much sense at all. I mean, as a bonus track, this would work pretty nicely, but being the conclusion to this project, it just feels like a really weird choice because these two styles have absolutely nothing to do with each other. And yeah, it just doesn't flow together nicely. It doesn't really conclude the album in a very cohesive way. It doesn't scream, hey, this is the conclusion to this album, we're going to tie everything up here. It just kind of seems like another weird genre experiment that just so happens to end off the project. Overall, just taken on its own, it's not a terrible track. St. Vitus actually do a pretty decent job in this style, but it's a bad closer to the album, I guess. Not a bad song, but a bad closer. So, yeah, another weird experiment from this thing. But, even though the fact that this album has several kind of weird experiments sprinkled into its track list, for the most part, it's a pretty uninteresting listen, mostly because a lot of these tracks that are kind of odder or more out of place for the band's typical sound, a lot of these tracks are still pretty boring at the end of the day, either that or they're placed in really awkward positions in the track listing. And for the most part, St. Vitus just kind of feel, like I said before with Bad Religion, like they're on autopilot on this thing, because for the most part on this thing, they're just kind of churning out their typical sound in a pretty adequate manner, not really producing material that I think is great or really all that good or anything. It's just barely passable. So yeah, I'd mostly just recommend this album to hardcore fans of the band, or if you're like a really hardcore fan of this style of music, maybe. But if you're not in that category of people, I wouldn't say to check this album out. Moving on, the final project I want to talk about is actually an EP. It is the newest EP from Jaden Smith, or Jaden, I guess, as he's now going by, based on the credits for this EP that I'm about to be talking about, titled ERYS is coming. I guess this is supposed to be like a prelude, or just kind of like a short little project to get people hyped up for his next studio album, which is supposed to be ERYS, the sequel project to his debut album back in 2017, Sire. I've never really been all that into Jaden and his music. I thought his debut project had potential in it, however, I didn't really care for it all that much. And then his last project, the Sunset Tapes that came out last year, was kind of like his debut album, with a lot of the interesting things that made that album kind of seem like it had potential, squeezed out of it. It was just a pretty boring and uninteresting album overall. I was hoping coming into this EP, though, that it was going to show me some of that potential again, or maybe even get me really excited for this upcoming album. But unfortunately, that is not the case here, as this EP is really just kind of more of the same of that last album Jaden dropped, in the sense that it's, once again, really boring and underwhelming and uninteresting. Overall, this project is one that just isn't super interesting to me, and I don't have a whole ton to say about it. The flows are pretty boring, the singing isn't really good, the beats aren't super exciting either, even if they are probably the strongest thing here. The lyrics across this thing aren't super interesting either. They're not particularly creative or introspective or funny or really anything. They just kind of exist to exist here on this project. For the most part, this is a pretty underwhelming listening experience, and it certainly doesn't get me hyped up for whatever Jaden's going to be releasing soon, I would guess. Jaden Smith fans might get more enjoyment out of this than I did, but, at least in my own opinion, I really didn't enjoy this all that much. But that is just my own personal opinion about this project, and that does conclude everything I have to say about it, and this video in general, really. If you happen to have any different opinions on any of the projects I talked about here today, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own thoughts on any of these projects in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this review. I typically do album reviews, track reviews, things like that, so if you enjoy that kind of content, make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.